we actually created a scientific tool. And that completely changed my whole life because, so there's two sides of this. Keep in mind that the whole point of Rocky, the whole goal of Rocky is to make sure that, and the next thing we know, it just started growing. And CAOS Linux started to be born, started to build out. So we approached the operating system also a little bit differently, and this is probably something worth noting. Is we wanted to, all of a sudden that changes the dynamic considerably in my mind, and I'm actually now nervous. So how are we going to manage this? How are we going to mitigate this? I am a very, very strong proponent that
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
Gregory, it is great to have you on the podcast. I would like to start with learning a little bit about your background. Can you tell us a little bit about how your tech journey has been and what do you do now?
So my background is in science and biochemistry, and in the late 90s, we determined that we needed to start running a lot of our genomics searches and running some of our scientific, computational simulations on-prem, like physically in our offices, and we started building computing systems to do this. Before that, we were using the NCBI supercomputers, the National Center for Bioinformatics Institute, the supercomputers that they provided, and we were connecting like with 28.8 modems and whatnot, and so we're like, we have to do this. We have to do this locally. And the founder at this point was, we were actually at Fry's Electronics, and he says, let's get a bunch of hardware and run Linux on it and see if we can do it. And I was like, Linux? What's Linux? That was the first time I heard Linux. I thought he was mispronouncing Unix. Thought he was, just making something up. But no, he was truly, this was something. And, we downloaded the first version of the operating system, which I think it was either Slackware or Debian. I don't remember now. And we downloaded it off our 28.8 modems. We wrote it to a bunch of floppy disks, and we installed a system based on that. And in fairly short order, we actually created a scientific tool. And that completely changed my whole life because I had to understand, like, how did we just download this thing off the internet for free and go and create something that's truly valuable to science, to research, and to everything that we're doing, but this was free. How does that work? Who makes this? Like, where'd it come from? So I became completely enamored with this, and it ended up with me pivoting my career into computers, and specifically Linux and open source. What I learned from that experience, I just wanted to be part of it. I just wanted to be immersed in it. And I spent every waking hour, weekends, evenings, lunches, everything, learning everything I could. I was completely hooked. And it's learning everything I could about Linux, learning about open source, trying to become engaged with open source communities, only to find out that I was too young. I didn't know enough, and too green. And I just sounded like a fool. So it was hard for me to engage with some of these open source communities, because these had, there were people there that are brilliant and know their stuff. and back then, open source communities were difficult. Like, sometimes they had some pretty strong personalities in these communities. So I didn't hold out very well against a lot of that. So I found it difficult to be part of it, but I was still so enamored with it that I wanted to be. And my career just kind of shaped from there forward. But yeah, open source for me is game changing and life changing in terms of how it provides connections to other people, like-minded people. I know I've talked a lot already on this one question, but when I first started getting into open source and started having projects, I started realizing that I was able to work with other individuals who are in other parts of the world who I never would be able to communicate with otherwise. Like, we have a common ground. We have something we're working on together. And in my mind, this bridges everything. This bridges, geographical areas. This bridges politics. And all of a sudden, people that even our governments may not like each other, it becomes very clear we're all people. We're all in this together. And as a result of that, being able to work together kind of, again, just changes everything. And so, again, I was completely enamored. Like, this is not just software. This is an entire way of life.
Yeah, I think we can sometimes not use rather the word community and not really think about what it means, right? And that kindred spirit, that all seeking something together, and that common goal and that common desire. Like you said, it moves across geographies and everything else. And I've just been thinking about that recently, what that word really means and how applicable it is to what we do as opposed to just a group of people.
I thought source can change the world. Like, it could bring the whole world together. It can make the world a better place. Like, I really not only believed it then, I still believe it today. And this is, at the end of the day, I think, we're all in this together. This is one planet. We're all together. And I think open source is one of the few initiatives that I've seen that just bridges it all together, brings us all closer.
So when you learned about Linux, I assume that was your very first time of learning about this whole free and open source software and in ecosystem concept, right?
That was the first time I even heard the name, and I didn't know anything about it before that. I didn't even know open source existed before that.
I remember when we had the prep call before the podcast recording, you said something when you were talking about your first experience, like you learned about Linux and you were like, how do you mean that people do this for free? So do you remember how you got from that realization that this is not just software that you can download for free, but there are people who are spending, their free time to participate and work on the code. And then we all know that by today it became a whole way of corporate software and now hardware development method as well. But do you remember how you discovered the ecosystem behind just the code base of the Linux kernel?
Well, not just the Linux kernel, because I'm for a long time, I was not a great programmer. I'm still not, honestly. But I did not get involved with the Linux kernel. I tried watching the mailing list for a while and just realizing so much of that was just over my head. I really wanted to get involved in the operating system or bringing it together. So the kernel is one piece of it, but bringing everything together, building everything, compiling everything, and making a whole bunch of projects just, again, work together. And I started working on that with a number of people, and that actually became the beginning of CAOS Linux, CAOS, CAOS. And it stood for Community Assembled Operating System. And that was my first kind of initial foray into open source, and it was all IRC. And most of the people that were contributing to this and working with us, they weren't getting paid to do it. This was them working in their personal time and doing this as hobbies. And you can really see this as well, early conferences around Linux. And I remember in San Jose, and then it moved to San Francisco, we used to have something called Linux World. And the Linux World conference, it really started off as, it was a very just kind of underground movement, like a bunch of hackers, a bunch of programmers, not much corporate representation there. There was a little bit, but not a huge amount early on. Most people showing up in shorts and flip-flops, and very casual. And over the years, as you start watching this, you start to see more and more people showing up in suits, more and more businesses, more and more large businesses, Intel, IBM, right? These very large companies that are representing themselves at these conferences. And you start to see the culture changing from underground movement of individuals to now corporations coming into this. And the influx of corporations coming into this has been fantastic, because it's not that it's better at all than individuals coming in. Like, they're both fantastic, but it brought a level of professionalism, stability, and money into this whole ecosystem in a way that actually now kind of made it more mainstream. And it was funny, before the creation of Rocky Linux, I was actually having a conversation with several people thinking, it's really a shame that newer generations, younger generations, aren't going to see the same level of kind of open source that we saw in its beginnings, 20, 25 years ago. And, I felt as though I gained so much about myself and my place within my career and how I work and how I see the world through that. It was really just a shame that doesn't exist again. And I thought in a million years it would never happen. And then literally it happened almost like the next week with Rocky Linux, which was a completely underground movement to create an entire operating system. And we went from 0 to 10,000 in a month and a half, 10,000 people in a month and a half. Again, I didn't think that would ever happen again. And so I'm thankful and I'm grateful that, it happened, because it changed a number of people's lives within the Rocky ecosystem. And people who I think might not have ever had the same opportunities now have these amazing, wonderful opportunities in working with a community like this and others.
Clearly, Rocky Linux was a scratch your own itch and very much an independent, individual kind of effort. I'm curious, when you created CAOS, what was the itch? Debian existed at the time, and as you mentioned, Slackware as well. So what was the itch? Why did you create CAOS?
So at the end of the 90s, I worked for a company called Linux Care. And Linux Care was the first real Linux company that I had a chance to work with, a company focused on Linux. And what I learned from that was, first off, I learned I really loved Debian. And Debian was my go-to operating system as a result of that. How the community worked together, how the maintainers worked together, everything about it, I just really loved and appreciated. So when I got a job at Department of Energy in 2000, I come to realize that they have already standardized on Red Hat as their primary operating system. And when I dug a little deeper, it wasn't that they standardized on Red Hat. They standardized on the look and feel of Red Hat as an operating system. They standardized on RPM. They standardized on that file hierarchy, that mechanism of how to maintain a system. And it's fairly different from Debian, and all the Linux distributions are kind of different in this way. So when I started, using Red Hat and the supported operating systems, it became clear to me that really what I missed the most was the community. And CAOS was a goal to try to fix that, try to create an RPM distribution of Linux that was community-based. And this is well before Fedora existed. So the only things that really, at that point, that were RPM-based, everything was commercial, nothing community. There was, of course, Red Hat. There was Mandrake. It wasn't even Mandriva at the point. It was Mandrake. There was Corel Linux. Corel Linux might have been based on Debian. I'm actually having a hard time remembering now, but there was SUSE, but everything was commercially kind of run. And I'm like, I want the community to do this. I want to do this as part of, community effort. And CAOS Linux was built and designed to kind of fill that gap. Created some goals, some vision statements, started building some code and some infrastructure, had a channel on IRC. People would randomly join channels and just, like, what are you doing here? Oh, I know somebody who might be interested in that. And they would go get that person. And next thing I know is there was a few other people that were associated with the channel. Some of them had other connections that did stuff like this. And the next thing we know, it just started growing. And CAOS Linux started to be born, started to build out. So we approached the operating system also a little bit differently, and this is probably something worth noting. Is we wanted to have the stability of Debian, but we also wanted to have packages that moved a lot faster than Debian. And so we bisected the operating system from a core. We had the CAOS core, and then we had the CAOS extra operating system, which stood on top of the core. And the core was a self-hosting build root, which allowed us to focus on kind of the initial core absolute stable packages. And then everything that rides on top of this build root is free to move a lot more freely. So your window manager, for example, what web browser you're using, those can all move very freely on top of this very stable core. We felt as though it gave us the best of all worlds. So we built this operating system and got a lot of support for it. And then
I was actually around at HP at that time. And part of my job was I was responsible for the distribution strategy for Linux for HP. And at the time, I had Red Hat and SUSE in the server space. I had Red Hat and Mandrake at the workstation space. And I had Red Hat and Monte Vista in the embedded space. Because I wanted competition for Red Hat because they were spanning all three at the time. And that seemed to make sense. But of course, all of our Linux developers were dedicated Debian users. Yeah. Right. And BDL Garby was part of that team. Right. And so he was obviously one of the leaders in Debian as well, and project leader at that time. But yeah, that and you mentioned the conferences. I started doing those conferences in 2001, so they were already rather big. And HP was one of those big names that was going. And, we had IDG conference in January in New York, and we had the other big conference out. I think that was also still IDG back in San Francisco, and those ran for several years. But yeah, that was a great eclectic collection, right, of corporate folk meeting the open source community. And it was really helpful to take corporate people to those events because they had no clue what the value was, what the momentum was, and those events. And to this day, taking corporate types to events is one of the best ways to educate them as to what open source really does and is capable of.
I'm curious, you were the creator of CAOS, and then you were also one of the founders of CentOS and then Rocky Linux. And this spans over a longer period of time. Was the experience of creating these projects very similar? Or as the ecosystem has been evolving, like creating CAOS versus creating Rocky Linux, was that completely different?
That is a really good question. So the goal of CAOS and CentOS was very different. But at the beginning, in the early days, a lot of the build tools and scripts and things that we created, infrastructure that we created around CAOS Linux, applied to what we were doing with CentOS. And CentOS was created because, and I think this might be an interesting story to tell, CentOS was created because Red Hat used to give away their operating system for free. So even though it was commercially controlled, it was freely available. They stopped doing that with the creation of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So Red Hat Linux, which was the freely available distribution, which all organizations at that point, maybe not all, but a lot of organizations, to the point you mentioned, Phil, was standardized on this because it met a huge amount of needs, and it was really enterprise focused, and professional IT teams worldwide just leveraged that. So when they end of lifed it, it affected what we were doing at Department of Energy at my lab, Berkeley Lab. And we said, well, we kind of need a solution here. And so we applied the same build scripts, methodologies, and tools, and a lot of the same even individuals that was working on CAOS to start rebuilding the Red Hat source RPMs. And at first, we weren't doing it to build an operating system. We were doing it to help us create CAOS Linux. We needed a build environment. We needed that core. And a lot of that core was shared with Red Hat to ensure a common unified base API. And so we were like, well, we still need to do this. So we started building the operating system. And at this point, Whitebox Enterprise Linux was released to the world. And Whitebox was a full rebuild of Red Hat Enterprise Linux sources. And it was created, I believe, if my memory serves, I believe it was created by John Morris. And John was overwhelmed a little bit. And I don't mean to put words in his mouth. He can definitely correct me on this. But it definitely felt like he was overwhelmed with the amount of attention that Whitebox Enterprise Linux got. And I reached out to him and I said, we're kind of doing something similar. We got this whole community. Should we join forces? And he said, this was a little bit overwhelming for what he was signing up to do. He didn't realize he was signed up to make an operating system for the whole world. So he said, if you want to just take over, please go right ahead. And so we ended up coming up with a name for what we were creating and called it CentOS, and released it to the world. And it just immediately took over. And as a result, it did dwarf what we were doing with CAOS Linux. And most people assumed that there was a lineage between CAOS Linux to CentOS. There wasn't truly a lineage, but that's how most people assumed. So most people then figured CAOS Linux now was done. It wasn't done, but we lost almost all of our inertia at that point. And it almost all of it went over to CentOS. And then due to just how things evolved with CentOS, CentOS ended up leaving the CAOS Foundation, and there's a little bit of politics that occurred there and whatnot, as happens, fairly often. But we separated, and I was then no longer associated with it. But up until that point, I was the project lead of CAOS Linux. I was the director of the CAOS Foundation and the project lead of CentOS.
And as a collaboration model, distributions are different, right? I mean, talk a little bit about what it's like coordinating a distribution, right? I know a little bit about like the Debian ecosystem and package maintainers, and when you want to bring a new package in, and of course they've got all kinds of processes around how they do their intake. They're a very process-oriented group, as I'm sure you know. But I mean, I don't expect, many people in the Rocky community are hacking on the Linux kernel, but correct me if I'm wrong, if that's not the case. Well, where is actual development on software versus doing all of the hard work and all of the reviews and all of the maintenance and tracking of vulnerabilities and bringing in new versions, all the things? Talk about what your ecosystem actually looks like in Rocky and what those people that are volunteering in your ecosystem actually do on a day-to-day basis.
So there's two sides of this. Keep in mind that the whole point of Rocky, the whole goal of Rocky is to make sure that people have a standard as an operating system. Mm-hmm. We've had the choice multiple times if we're going to fork and go in a different direction than Enterprise Linux. And I used Enterprise Linux term semi loosely. It's a standard that is currently being maintained by Red Hat, is how I loosely describe it. But it's a standard that is being used pervasively in a lot of places. And but it's also, because it's being maintained by a commercial entity, they kind of own and control that standard, and that's part of their business, their sales process. But being an open standard, it's better for that to be have other implementations. And I do call it a standard. I do think it is an open standard. They don't want, to be clear, I'm not sure if I should say this, but they don't want to have anyone else implementing that open standard. They want to be the only organization implementing that open standard. Rocky's goal is to be a freely available implementation of that open standard. So as much as we can, we actively try not to diverge from Rocky Linux, right? Rocky Linux is following, it is the successor to CentOS. So everything that CentOS brought forth and all the reasons that CentOS had a lot of users and was supporting those users and use cases, et cetera, Rocky's filling that gap, that hole now. But when we think about operating system development, so Debian is definitely doing operating system development. Like they're building and kind of managing their own standard of the operating system. And I typically look at it in two areas. You've got your kernel space and you got your user space. Kernel space is literally one package, but it is a gigantic, critical, massive package. And then you've got thousands of other packages that are other open source projects from all over the world. But you can loosely make the categorization of, you got your kernel space and you got your user space. The two you have to manage differently, generally speaking. The kernel space, and the kernel space can get very tricky as well. So we actually just released a white paper, a data sheet on vendor maintained kernels. And there's the Red Hat does this, but there's a lot more than just Red Hat that has their own vendor kernels. And the idea of a vendor kernel is you take something from kernel.org, you take a snapshot of it, you grab it, and from that moment on, you're kind of working inside of your fork of that. And over time, you may backport lots of things or bring in, cherry pick many things coming from the upstream community. But for the most part, you're owning and controlling that kernel. So we just did a paper, or my team just did a paper. I wish I can claim credit for it, but they're much, much smarter than I am. And then they came up with this, and they realized that when they were reassembling a lot of a particular, you can probably guess which, but a particular vendor kernel, they recognized how many bug fixes were applicable to that kernel, but not imported, not cherry-picked from upstream. Thousands. And if you go talk to many of the kernel developers, every bug in the kernel could be used as a security exploit. So if you consider that, the kernel that most of us are using in enterprise Linux has, and I'll use the bigger number that they found, over 5,000 bugs that are unfixed from upstream. All of a sudden, that changes the dynamic considerably in my mind. And I'm actually now nervous, especially now that the kernel has its own CNE. So the kernel's doing their own CVEs. Now, they don't have CVSS scores associated with them, but they're doing their own CVEs for every bug, which means now all of a sudden the entire ecosystem is going to have a ton of CVEs associated with it. And there's almost no way a vendor forked kernel can keep up with upstream. So how are we going to manage this? How are we going to mitigate this? I am a very, very strong proponent that we need to be working much closer with the upstream kernel as the standard kernel. So when we talk about operating system development, and Debian does this to some extent, so does Ubuntu, so does SUSE, so does Oracle. This is how most kernels are maintained. Android is a tremendous example of this. Android kernels they follow a monthly cadence of the stable kernel from Greg Kroah-Hartman and the kernel team. So they are doing it incredibly successfully. Well, depending on your definition of successful, I consider it very successful. And
they're somewhat unique, right? I mean, Android is doing, even Debian, right? You've got unstable if that's where you want to go, but most people stay stable, and that's a much longer time frame, right? And so that's the balance, is the stability versus bugs. And as you say, yes, the kernel folk have become rather adamant that every bug is a potential vulnerability, and then therefore a potential exploit. And so, those are big changes that the kernel community's made just within the last year, as far as really trying to say this. But I don't. For me, I understand why you do it, right? You've got that balance of stability, and I think whatever Android is doing to allow for that, it's just, I don't know. It's easier to maintain in mobile. I wouldn't know why, though, as I sit here and think about that. Why? How do they do this? Because that's magic.
I don't think it's easier to maintain in mobile. I think that
I agree.
They have the biggest exploit surface. Android is by far the most utilized operating system now worldwide, by far. So, they recognize that they have to keep this secure, and the best way of keeping it secure is to keep current on the kernel. So I think that's what really drove it.
We talked a lot about creating open source projects and communities, and like CentOS has been long living. Rocky Linux we will obviously see, but you have a lot of experience with the creation of these projects and also overseeing them throughout their journey and life cycle to different extents. From community perspective, is there something that you would mention as a key to success, and not just success in terms of achieving what the goal of the people who were creating the project, but also making it sustainable and long living? Like, is there anything that all the projects that you were there creating did similar ways that made them successful and long living, or was it different every single time?
So this is a really interesting question, because a lot of people who think about open source think about it from the perspective that they have to be a software developer to be part of open source. And I challenge that wholeheartedly. I mean, obviously, software developers are absolutely important role to open source. But for a project to become sustainable, as you mentioned, the open source project has to be good at a lot of different things. And I was just having a conversation with my community team on the Rocky and RESF side about sponsorships. We want sponsorships. We want to engage with sponsorships. And we were talking about who is best equipped to do that, to go talk with companies and whatnot. And I'm like, a salesperson is honestly best equipped to that. But salespeople, generally speaking, are not thought of as valuable contributors to open source, or marketing people. Like, you do need to think about this to some extent. A lot of the people that contribute and are part of open source projects, they're fantastic at the areas in which they excel. So in most cases, you're talking about software developers, you're talking about engineers, etc. You need a plethora of different personalities and skill sets for an open source project to really be sustainable and successful. And we, as a community, I don't think has done a fantastic job of making this inclusive to people who are not just engineers. And I think we need to do better at that to make these open source projects even better and again, more sustainable. And when we talk about sustainability, we also have to mention, of course, the dreaded money point. Like, it takes money to run an open source project. Not all open source projects take money, but many of them do, especially the bigger ones. It takes capital, it takes resources. And at some point, it might take full-time employees to deal with some of the management of it. And how do you deal with that? So it's incredibly important to have a lot of different roles associated with that. And the one thing I've seen is, a lot of times people that come in that do not have an engineering background, they feel almost like they are in many cases, I hate to describe it like this, but I think this is true, almost like they're the second-class citizen of the open source project, and they're not actually core members, and they can never be core members of that open source project. And I think that is something that is wrong. And I think we have to do much better as an open source community in totality to fix that. And again, the last point I'll just mention on this is the value that brings is massive. And a lot of open source projects, again, there's different scopes, right? If you're talking about an open source project that has a few engineers and it's got niche users and it's very valuable to those niche users, I mean, you don't necessarily need a sales team or a revenue team or somebody to manage your operations. You don't need that. But if you've got a project that has, I'd say, over 25 people that are dedicated, to that project, maybe even approaching 50 people or more, you now have some real management problems that you have to address. And it takes much more than just a bunch of, engineers, even great engineers. Some engineers actually have some management, knacks skills that they can leverage. But many engineers don't want to even think about being a manager. They're like, my career path is this, not that. And as a result, a lot of open source projects lack management. They lack operations. They lack the rigor and accountability that's necessary to drive success for the users of that project. So I guess the last piece that I think is related to that is you have to know who your community is. And if your community is, again, kind of this niche group and it's not that big, but you're solving a really impactful problem for those people, that's fantastic. That is great. But if you're solving a problem for people that make their living doing whatever it is that you're providing, you have to treat them and understand their situation extremely carefully and understand that they're making decisions that could affect their livelihood on what operating system, for example, are they going to choose? And if they choose Rocky Linux, we have to recognize that decision comes with a lot of responsibility for us. Mm-hmm. And we have to now have rigor. We have to have accountability. We have to have milestones, roadmaps, timelines, testing, QA, all of these sorts of things. And you have to spend a lot of time and effort to make sure that you are doing justice to your user community. And the first step is just knowing who your user community is.
Yep.
Yeah, I think those are very important points, like user community. Like users have to be part of your ecosystem as a community. If they are not, then how on earth will you ever know whether what you're creating is actually used by anyone? Is it usable by anyone? And if you're not creating that feedback loop, it's really hard to take it into a direction that is actually benefiting the ecosystem. So if it's anything else than a hobby project, and even for hobby projects, it's nice to be in touch with the people who are actually using what you're creating. But if it's anything more than that, then having, contact with users is just a must. And I think the OpenStack community got to the point at one time to have people from the user ecosystem actually be part of the technical committee. They did have a user committee, and then it got merged together with the technical committee to have that feedback loop and representation. I'm pretty sure that there are people who think it was a great idea, and there probably are still people who think it was the worst idea ever. But I think that it is the direction to go, definitely, when it comes to open source communities and success and sustainability. And the management aspect that you brought up, I think that's another critical one, because I've seen so many projects where you would need project managers. And if a software developer turns into one, then you're either losing a good software developer or you're ending up with a burned out person real fast, because they are trying to do two things 100%. And if you don't do them with 100%, then, it doesn't fly. And project management, that is so critical. And it is not something that's viewed as, something that someone could contribute. I think what's more accepted is, technical writers and writing documentation. That is something that got accepted as, contribution that is not, it's not code, but it's still very technical contribution. But things like the project management angle, that's just not really, or I haven't really seen. Like, I do work for a foundation and we do have community managers, but community management and project management, those are two completely different and separate things, because my role as a community manager is to make sure that, users have a place in the ecosystem, everyone, plays on a level playing field, the environment is welcoming, peaceful, productive. So providing a lot of supporting functions to the community, but I'm not sitting there as a project manager saying that this thing hasn't been reviewed for a while, this feature is not going anywhere. And yes, there is release management, there is this and that, but I really rarely see anyone getting involved and investing, someone who's actually there to do project management and making sure that nothing falls through the cracks. And those kind of things. And I'm really hoping that we will start to converge towards that, especially in bigger and busier communities where it would make a difference, like a really, really big difference.
So it's funny, this conversation just came up this morning as we were talking with our community team. I have a saying, which is, if an open source project isn't growing, it's dying. And so part of the mission of our community team is to make sure that we're always creating opportunity and messaging around joining Rocky. As a matter of fact, even in our bylaws, you can't be a board member unless within the last 12 months you have mentored somebody to come and join. So it is literally hard-coded that people have to be inviting other people in. So The Rocky bylaws are completely public. So here, let me even just show you real quick where it is. So I just opened up a web browser to RESF, and I'm looking for the share screen.
I mean, only because, burnout is something that is, more and more in the center of conversation as well. It's very real. And it is threatening to projects, especially where, diversity is not where it should be, and then those kind of things. So, yeah.
Eligibility and have mentored at least. So this is for the board, project boards and project teams. You need to have mentored and or invited at least one member within the last 12 months.
Before we depart, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source? Some kind of a hobby or fun fact?
Well, I have a guitar right over here, so I like playing with the guitar. I like music. I like fun fact, motorcycles. Although I haven't ridden much lately, but I used to be sponsored by a large motorcycle manufacturer for racing motocross. Long time ago.
Wow.
Many broken bones ago.
Oh. The broken bones are not fun, but so it was it still a hobby, or it was something that you done like half professionally?
No, it was still, I was on the amateur circuit, so it was still a hobby. So I just broke I broke my bones just for fun.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver budget, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is.
That's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it. Simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you